I want to say is I think that, Rod, the way that you've conceptualised these wish lists of hazards that are in codes of practice, which are not unhelpful. I'm not being critical in any way. They're not unhelpful. But the way you've conceptualised them into 5 key areas, I think, is one of the really beneficial things that I took out of the book as a way to conceptualise, think about, approach and manage these areas of risk.
The concept of psychosocial risk is far from new, but the dialogue and industry discussion about the topic has elevated since regulatory changes were announced in 2023 and 2024. Psychosocial risk is now the focus of many conversations in the corporate world, from boardrooms to executive teams, and of course through to the practitioners on the ground, trying to join the dots to have meaningful impact. I'm Kate Connors. I'm a master's qualified psychologist, and my professional purpose is to help people and workplaces be at their best.
And I'm Greg Smith. I'm a lawyer who's spent more than 30 years practicing in the areas of employment law and workplace health and safety. I'm also the author of several books, including Paper Safe and the recently published Proving Safety.
And you are listening to Judgmental, when a psychologist and a lawyer walk into a barside chat about psychosocial risk. A big thanks to our sponsor, EML. EML are Australia's largest personal injury claims provider, providing claims management services to workers' compensation, life insurance and CTP markets, with the purpose of helping people get their lives back. We have another jam-packed episode today, so grab a drink and sit back for another discussion at the bar. Listeners, and welcome again to another episode of Judgmental. Thank you so much for joining Greg and I for our bar-side conversation about psychosocial risk. Hello, Mr. Smith. How are you today?
Good, Kate, good. It feels like we hadn't talked to each other for ages and now we're going back to back sessions. Catching up.
I know.
It's good.
We've got momentum. We've got the big mo, as people would say. Well, before we kick off any further...
Who says that?
Some people do. I know where I got that from. That is a West Wing quote.
Okay.
The big mo, baby, the big mo. Anywho,
right.
It's very remiss that we haven't already done this, so I will make sure that we address that now and do the acknowledgement of the traditional lands where I am today, which is the lands of the Wiradjuri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And where are you today, Greg?
I'm down south. I'm on the lands of the Bajara people of the Noongar Nation down near Mandurah today.
So, and here we are again, ready for a little quick recap on part one. But Rod, thanks for joining us again to complete our conversation on the net effect. How are you today?
Really well, thanks. Good to be here. Good to be back.
And so today we were going to have a much more focused conversation on controls and hazards and a couple of the different, or the two different, I guess, methodologies. Would you call them methodologies, frameworks? What word would you use to describe the different approaches that you've put forward to the traditional ones, Rod?
I guess the approaches.
Approaches. That works.
Okay.
Well, I thought it would be good just to, in case there were people who had a little bit of a gap between listening to part one and part two, that we just did a small little recap on the first conversation that we had. Rod, what were the key things that you thought were important from our last chat that would be good for people to get their heads around before we do our deep dive into the controls and hazards approaches?
Probably the first one is that the hazards are interrelated. They share variance and they overlap and they multiply each other in terms of outcomes. They add up, they multiply. They work in an interrelated way in a complex manner. Let's just say that. And the individual is kind of in the middle of the system, if you like, as the interpreter of these hazards. And the meaning that the hazards have individually and collectively is very much mediated by that individual difference that we all have, our prior experiences, our psychological makeup, our emotional state. And so that creates a set of conditions that is quite different to traditional risk management, where we're dealing with, things of the physical world. You have a brick, it will fall on you from height. We can calculate the velocity of that brick. We can calculate what kind of damage that brick is going to do if it lands on your head. We can put controls around making sure the brick doesn't fall. It's all very linear. It's all very kind of the causal pathway is super clear. And of course, in psychological and psychosocial, in the psychosocial world, all of that becomes quite blurred. And whilst I still believe that there is value in using our so our safety and risk management lenses in psychosocial work, we need to make sure that we are adjusting for the complexity that this work brings with it. And I guess that's what the thrust of the argument is. It's like, it's not about throwing away the hierarchy of control, but it's actually realizing that that hierarchy of control has been designed with causal pathways that are linear and clear, causal effects, established in the natural world, and that when we deal with psychological aspects, that is much more complex. And the traditional approach of kind of one hazard, one control also kind of is not that it's called into question, but it is that because there's so much variability, there's so much overlap between the hazards, it makes sense that when you're dealing with one hazard, you are probably going to deal with the control of another hazard at the same time.
That's brilliant. I appreciate you drawing that conversation into that kind of distillation like that. And I think it's a really good way for us to anchor into this next deeper dive into the hazards and then the controls piece. Greg, was there anything you wanted to add to that, as well as I've just remembered I've neglected our drinks orders. So quickly, Rod, anything?
I would love a spring water, please.
Done. Greg, do you need something heavier today?
No, I need an espresso today. Just to...
Espresso. I'm going to sit with my cup of tea.
Oh, God, we're all a bit lame.
Let's keep away from any substances zone. But Greg, was there anything else from that conversation from part one that you wanted to just really kind of put front and center before we get into this next part of the hazards and controls?
Not especially, except to say that I think one of the things we're finding in physical safety is it is not as linear as the legislation would like to believe it to be. And so I think the complexities almost the wickedness that Rod's drawing out in the net effect, I think there are lessons beyond the psychosocial in that thesis, that idea, that really do start to translate into the physical harm world as well.
And I think the thing for me with my lens over it is very much around then the multifaceted way that leadership, as well as that an underlying commitment to care of each other, has across particularly the psychosocial hazards and control space. But interestingly, also to Greg's point and to a conversation that's coming up soon for listeners, that we've had a conversation recently about how that also plays out so clearly in the physical health space too. So hopefully that kind of message is getting through very much. So let's do this then, Rod. I'm keen to for you to share as much as what you think is kind of reasonable in a little verbal share to summarise for people your 5-domain model that you put forward in terms of a different way to consider hazards, the psychosocial hazards. Like as we know, I think it's between 13 and 15 different hazards are listed depending on which state is listed in different codes of practice, etc., according to the jurisdiction. But in the book, you speak to that doesn't really work with this in terms of the way psychosocial hazards work, but also then the impact of that in thinking through risk registers and control mechanisms as well. So I'd love for you to share this approach that you've got, which is you've distilled it down into more of a 5-domain approach.
Yeah, and basically what this really is just chunking down the complexity of all of those hazards and just really looking at, if you look at the variance of all of the hazards that are reported, where do they cluster, right? And so it's almost like a cluster analysis of hazards. And my PhD work was really interested in terms of workers' compensation claims. What are the precipitating factors, we were calling them, that really are more likely to be accepted by an insurance company for psychological injury than others? And so there's two things that I think is really important to flesh out here a little bit. One is psychological distress is a normal part of life, and we all experience that. Psychological distress alone isn't enough to cause psychological harm, which is ongoing, and or a psychological injury, which is actually a legal, political, and biopsychosocial kind of entity, right? And so I was really interested in that legal, political, biopsychosocial entity, not just in the diagnosis. I was interested in what actually happens at work that then classifies as an accepted claim for psychological injury under a workers' compensation setting. And what I found out was that there were kind of 5 different domains that kind of predicted whether or not psychological distress became a mental disorder, first of all, first threshold. And secondly, whether that mental disorder was attributable significantly or substantially to the employment of that patient. And so that's where the classifications came from. They are classifying psychological injuries that were more or less likely to be accepted. And what came out of the research is that interpersonal conflict or interpersonal hazards were the most predictive of an accepted claim and were the most predictive of significant psychopathology. So there was something particularly important about how we relate to people, other people at the workplace. The second one was traumatic hazards. So if you were involved in a traumatic event at work, then that was highly related with a diagnosable disorder and also an acceptable claim for workers' compensation. Organisational hazards, things like work design, rosters, things like that, were number 3 in the list. And then number 4 was job inherent hazards, which is where you would put things like workload. So things specifically to do with the way your work is. And that was interesting because I went into that thesis thinking workload is going to be the biggest thing that causes people to be unwell and to be accepted. And interestingly, it wasn't. It was kind of like a background factor, but it did feature. And what it kind of suggested was that we all expect to work hard at work, that it's not a psychopathogenic or not as psychopathogenic as other hazards. The most psychopathogenic was poor interpersonal relationships with people around us, and particularly with our supervisors and leaders. And the 5th one was around physical distance and sort of working away from home and being isolated and things like that. Then in the context of organizing the hazards, simply that kind of statistical loading of the research was applied to the new hazard. They were clumped together into this 5 main hazards approach. And I think what it does is it says, let's focus on the 5 things, the 5 big bucket of things that happen at work that we need to really think about, and then we need to start controlling, right? And so if we have these 5 main hazard buckets, then we at the very least need 5 controls. That's not to say that that's all that you need, right? But it's kind of like that's the logic that I think follows, is that we need to be able to demonstrate that we are managing these hazards at some level and that we are making controls applicable to them. And that's kind of how that came about.
Yeah. So, Rod, what I find really interesting about how you've explained that is the connection between where the workers' compensation as the evidence of harm. Is that a fair summary back in terms of the way the statistical analysis was completed? So the harm via workers' compensation acknowledgement of harm.
So yes and no. What turned out to happen was that having harm occur to you in the workplace, it didn't discriminate whether or not your workers' compensation claim got accepted or denied. It was like, how we carry on a lot about, this claim may or may not be a real claim. It turned out in the research that out of 250 odd claimants, something like 97% of all claims were real claims, right? That you could establish that there had been harm that there was a psychological disorder that was substantially contributed to by the workplace. And so it kind of moved away then from the psychological injury being the kind of division between do they get accepted or do they get denied. It was more about actually most people who claim for psychological injury are actually suffering a mental disorder.
So what I think is kind of interesting in the connection of that, though, back into the workplace health and safety system is that with the way that the current hazards are listed and the way that people can go to WorkSafe and say, I would like for an inspector or we believe we are being subjected to a hazard, that is quite a different lens on the likelihood of harm from something to where you're saying from your research harm actually is more likely to that whole are all hazards equal thing. And so that's where I wanted to go to you, Greg, in that sense of how from a regulator or from a legal risk perspective, that all kind of pieces together when a lot of the research is saying interpersonal hazards are really the key hazards that need controlling, yet that's not really the way that the regulation or particularly inspections or improvement notices might play out.
Well, it's not just in large part, it's an analogy I often use in my own mind. It's like a ball of wool with different bits of thread sticking out of it. And depending on which thread you pull depends on how it's going to unravel. So you take something like bullying. I can be bullied, you take an allegation of bullying. I can have suffered recognisable psychosocial harm. There's no question about that. But I can have my workers' compensation claim denied because it was actually reasonable management action. Doesn't meet the technical definition of bullying, or if it was reasonable. Or because the person's no longer I can go to the Fair Work Commission, to the anti-bullying jurisdiction, and because the person who did the bullying has left the organisation, they've got no power to make any orders because their orders are to stop or prevent bullying, and if the person's left, it can't continue. Or I can go to WorkSafe and WorkSafe can say, well, the procedures in place to manage this were reasonably practicable and therefore we don't need to intervene. So it is theoretically possible for a person to actually suffer diagnosable harm because of a workplace interaction and have no legal recourse. And we've talked about this a lot, Kate, this difference between suffering harm and actually having a legal recourse. I think that they're two different things.
In my interactions with regulators, which I've had quite a few, there may be a complaint of a particular hazard, but when the regulator comes in, what they're interested in is, what does your system of work look like? And how does your system of work systematically and systemically deal with psychosocial issues in the workplace? And through that, they will decide whether you have a particular hazard problem or whether you have a system problem. And they're becoming more and more, they're modernizing the way in which they're looking at all of these hazards, because they are now actually looking for the net. Even though the legislation might still speaking about, one by one hazard, when the regulators come knocking at your door, they really are interested in your system of work, and that system is a net. How does all this stuff that you're doing, how does it work to prevent and manage psychosocial harm in the workplace?
And how is it all interconnected? What's happening over here match what's happening over there?
And how is it all interconnected? And you can show them a really nice process and procedure, and then they will say, okay, well, I'll take this process and procedure and I'm going to go to the shop floor and I'm going to see if people in the shop floor have ever seen it. And I'm going to check that, they understand it. And I'm going to check, when was the last time that, you say here that you consult with people, when I want to see the records of your last consultation, so that they will follow the threads of your management system and really test that you're doing what you say you're doing. So in many, many ways, I think there is actually quite a lot of agreement between this net effect kind of approach and what the ultimately regulators are looking for, which is living evidence that there is a system of work that has been designed in a way that is not just considering these hazards, but managing them actively and controlling them where they occur.
And to be fair, that's not untypical in the context. There's two parts to that, though. That's not unusual in the context of physical harm either. They will test the system in that way, although it does tend to get narrower and more focused if you move to a prosecution. So improvement and prohibition notices and regulator interventions can be broader, although even that we're seeing more challenges these days, whereas the prosecution is more linear. It doesn't do the interaction as well. But the other risk in all of this, in the way that this whole ecosystem, if you like, is designed around employment, safety and compensation, particularly with some of the more recent shifts in the compensation regimes around making psychosocial harm more difficult to access, is we run the risk that organisations, and I've been concerned about this for a good while, organisations are managing the legal risk, not the potential harm, which you can do. You can do that in the structures. You can have people being harmed and still manage your legal risk. So it's not quite as aligned as I think a lot of people might have thought it would be on sort of first blush of what this was intended to achieve.
And I think when I, look back on my career and the degree of harm experienced and connect that back to the 5 domains that you've outlined and this approach in your book, Rod, to me, that matches in terms of the people that I have supported who have been the most harmed, if you can quantify that without me having done a particular database assessment, but my own just clinical judgment. It's the interpersonal hazards that absolutely I've watched people, puddles on the floor, not able to actually speak about what might have been a bullying experience or a harassment experience. They are filled with such shame, the psychological impact of the shame, the distress, the sense of fault because of the way that psychological mechanism is unfolding in their mind and in their heart and soul almost leads to that degree of harm. It's the interpersonal stuff. And then when you go to the next one, the traumatic, everyone can again make sense of that. A traumatic incident, a robbery, watching someone be killed. These things make sense to people in terms of that experience of harm. It's the third and the fourth and the fifth one that I think become a little bit, well, actually, sometimes the interpersonal one people don't quite understand in the workplace, do they? When you're trying to do your mitigation and you're trying to sort of put people are like, why can't people just talk to each other and all these types of things? So it is actually, I think, a really interesting way to consider this question that you pose in the book, are all hazards equal? But to me, then it goes, well, therefore, are we placing our resources in the right buckets to address the potential of harm, which then goes back to Greg's point that sometimes the resources are going into the areas which is actually more about managing legal risk rather than about managing the degree of harm. I'm not sure if either of you where that big spiel that I just did comes to, but that's what's on my mind.
Can I let Rod speak to that in a moment? All I want to say is I think that, Rod, the way that you've conceptualised these wish lists of hazards that are in codes of practice, which are not unhelpful. I'm not being critical in any way. They're not unhelpful. But the way you've conceptualised them into 5 key areas, I think, is one of the really beneficial things that I took out of the book as a way to conceptualise, think about, approach and manage these areas of risk.
Yeah, and to me, it's difficult to manage all of it at once, particularly when you're just beginning to tackle the significant problem that it is. And I think that the book is gently saying, start with number 1. Like if our leaders could just be managing conflict better, both between leaders, within teams, then we really start to crack the back of this. And I know that leaders, we were talking last week, have a lot to do, right? But it's kind of like, how do we make this an expectation that is of actually of a good leader? And we've stopped short. We call it social support, but leadership is kind of both potentially a hazard. Good leadership is a protective factor. Poor leadership is a hazard, and we haven't gone out there and named it. But
No, I have.
There you go.
Oh, no, we've definitely talked about that on the podcast, that leadership is a hazard and a protective factor, most definitely.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And a protecting factor. And, we tend to kind of skirt around that a little bit. But I think we need to kind of say it outright. Your leader has more influence over your mental health than your general practitioner. That's astonishing, right? And so we need to really think about how we equip leaders with the knowledge and with the practical skills to be able to lead people in the good and in the bad times. And sometimes when we are in conflict, and conflict kind of gets a bad rap because not all conflict is bad. The conflict that was particularly damaging is the conflict that starts telling an individual a story that is actually quite personal and quite defining of themselves. So you are a bad person is what the conflict ends up sounding like. And that's the damaging kind of bit of it.
And I think at one level, this is where individuals and organizations really struggle, is that, let's call it the damaging conflict, can look exactly the same on two different occasions. And one occasion it causes no damage and the next occasion it does. And I think when we talk psychosocial risk, that is probably the bit that most organizations struggle with the most. I won't call it a reality, but the perception that it's so hard to know when behavior crosses into that domain where it starts to cause harm when it hasn't in the past.
And I think that's probably a good segue. And I'm just conscious of time that we move into the control ecosystem conversation, because to me, Rod, what we're just talking about there in terms of individual difference, in terms of leadership, and in terms of mitigating controls and preventing controls, all of those things are all intersecting in our conceptualization of why in one situation someone might get harmed and in another situation someone doesn't experience harm. So maybe if I can throw over to you again, Rod, a quick little tutorial maybe on the idea that you've got here in terms of 4 different layers within a control ecosystem, which to me was one of the most helpful components of the book, to be honest, for me in this, because I've always struggled with this idea of an enterprise-wide risk assessment and controls. And I've always thought there needed to be some kind of approach that was waterfalling it down to make it more meaningful. And I think the way you've done it here is makes a lot of sense. So if you could share a bit more of that with listeners, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I basically have taken the kind of bow tie approach, which is very familiar to a lot of people, particularly who work in the physical safety side of things. And the idea of a bow tie is that you're trying to prevent an event in the middle, right? And that event in the bow tie is psychosocial harm. And lots of different scenarios can be put into there that will lead to psychological harm. But really, if you then take the 5-domain approach, then you think about, well, what could be, it becomes like a network of controls that really are covering you for different levels of the different hazards, but also at the different levels of the organization. So we talk about cultural controls, organizational controls, functional controls, BAU controls, and local controls. And what that means is basically saying at the highest level, we really need to think about the culture of the organization as being a control in itself, right? There are some cultures that are more likely than others to lead to harm, and we need to think about how we deal with that. For example, and a lot of people find that cultural control a little bit sort of esoteric, but there was at one of my employers there was a process whereby all of the calibrations of people's pay were assessed through the lens of gender parity, and it was really aiming to make sure that if you had a level, let's say a level 3 job, and you were male, that if you were and you were getting paid $X thousand for that job, that you were also then getting paid the same amount if you were female for the same role in the same level. And you would think that this is actually kind of really easy to do and quite straightforward, but it required a significant kind of administrative process to make sure that, one, that happened, and secondly, that it worked, and that there was and every year a certain number of employees were found to be below where they should be, and it was corrected. So that to me isn't just a HR control, that is a cultural control. It's making sure that men and women are valued equally in the workplace. It is a systematic way to ensure that we have a level of equity, and that's what we believe in, and it's aligned with our values, right? So having a sexual harassment policy is one thing, but this goes to the next level of, when the regulator says, show me how it works. Like, well, this is how it works. We are culturally trying to achieve something. The next level is organizational. So, and that's where it's all about how you have policies and procedures. And the thing that I say to anyone who wants to work in this space is you already have a vast majority of your controls written. You just have to find them, and you have to think about how they link into the network, into the ecosystem. And you have to say, this is how the system will work, is working. And what you'll find then is that there are gaps in that system that you can fill, but already there's many things organizationally that are occurring, policies, procedures, rostering, all of these kinds of things. At the functional level, it's like, how do the functions kind of then get into this? How do we make that work so that it becomes a systematic way of working, as opposed to something that HR does versus something that safety does versus something. So there needs to be a cascading of this into a functional world.
Which is the breaking down the silos kind of idea, which is spoken about a
Exactly.
lot in different psychosocial seminars and different kind of learning moments. Yep.
Exactly. And then the next level is what I call the BAU controls, which are the whole number of things that happen in an organization each and every day by default that protect people from psychosocial harm, that are no longer part of a control system. They're part of the way in which we work. But if you don't put them in the bow tie, then they get lost. And you don't know that they're there. What I'm talking about here is fundamental things like security of your building. People from the outside cannot walk in and create a hazard in that manner. The way in which we provide facilities and amenities for our people, they may seem really routine, but they've become BAU controls, and they need to be kind of thought about. And the ultimate one is local, which is basically, how do you translate all of this stuff, the cultural controls, the organizational controls, the functional controls, into something that makes sense at the local level? And so that's really kind of a cascading of controls that make sense at every level. A functional control can look very differently when it is at a local level. If you're in a mining environment, in an asset, or if you're in a hospital, in an emergency department, or if you're in a production line in your specific area of production. And so it's actually making sure that the net covers everyone all the way down to where the work is done. And often what we do is we write these really nice controls up here that don't necessarily trickle all the way down and don't necessarily feed across the 5 domains. And so it's basically kind of creating a matrix of the domains versus the levels of the organization versus the granularity of the information that is needed. And some of those controls are going to be preventative, and some of them are going to be mitigating. And again, when you do a psychosocial risk assessment, you will find that most of the times organizations have a lot of mitigating controls, but not too many preventative controls. So they will have an EAP, they will have a process for trauma management, they will have a whole bunch of things in order to kind of try and manage an incident or an event once it's happened. But the preventative controls are the more difficult ones to kind of think about. And it's probably a challenge area for a lot of the people who listen to this podcast. So that's kind of an overall view of that kind of approach. It's multi-level and multifaceted.
So, Greg, I could see your brain ticking away there. What were your thoughts from when you're imagining a prosecution, or you're sitting there trying to tease something out in terms of what comes up with the regulator or a prosecution? How did that controls approach sit with you?
Well, that is the model that is anticipated in all safety management systems, and it's the model that's never achieved in practice. This is our classic dilemma of safety, full stop, is the disconnect between the expectations of the organisation at different levels and in particular how it translates to the front line. So whether you articulate that as paper safe or tick and flick or work as imagined, work versus work as done, or all the phraseology that exists around this stuff now, the safety of work, the work of safety, those sorts of things. The dilemma that we have is the failure to understand whether our processes are implemented in the way we expect them to be implemented at the different levels of the organisation, and whether they are effective to achieve the outcomes they're designed to achieve. And I was doing something the other day and talking to a group, and I said, look, fundamentally, the failure of legal risk management in this area is the failure of assurance. And I think that's what we're talking about. How do we go and give ourselves assurance that our expectations are being met at different levels of the organisation? And this is what I find to be problematic. So there was a fatality prosecution the other day, a known high risk activity with known controls, and when the fatality occurred, the evidence revealed that people had been acting in breach of the known controls over and over and over and over again until the way the work was done was just it had developed its own way of doing it, inconsistent with the articulated controls. Okay. Now, organisations struggle to gain proper assurance of their safety management systems in relation to the most obvious high risk linear hazards in their organisations. And I'm really curious what the future holds in terms of our capacity to even start imagining what that's going to look like around psychosocial risk. Because the people that we ask to do the assurance activities in our organisations don't have the skill sets to do it at the moment.
Well, I would say that too, that it's the leaders. I think leaders are expected to be the assurance kind of qualifier, as well as a key part. Like the leader is being expected to be a control, as well as to play some role in assurance of systems as well, I think.
That's the model of safety leadership. That's the whole mythology, the delusion that we sold to society around due diligence, was that the executives are going to have this assurance role to understand that our systems are in place and effective. That's not happening in any meaningful way. So that's going to be the struggle. And even in you look at organisations in the context of physical harm today, asking senior people in the organisation to articulate how reasonably straightforward physical controls are meant to be managed in the organisation, and the disconnect between what is described and what the organisation actually articulates through its processes is quite severe. I think that's going to be a compounded problem in psychosocial harm because we don't have yet a common sort of language to describe our expectations. We don't have a common language to describe what behaviours need to look like. We still have a very, very strong, and I don't think this is just Australian, but I think it's particularly white male Australian, reluctance to be involved in behavioural conversations, particularly about pulling up people on behaviours and what that's meant to look like. So it's a huge societal, cultural challenge that we've set for ourselves. I'm not saying that what is being described is not what the aspiration and the expectation ought to be, but we haven't landed it with basic physical harm yet. So our capacity to transition into the even more complex world of psychosocial harm is going to be a fascinating journey, I think, over the next few years.
Where's your brain at, Rod, when you listen to Greg's reflections there? Where do you go next?
Well, it is a huge challenge because, when you look at fatality records as near misses at significant events, they're not going away, right? And in fact, we have a persistent sort of challenge to continue to deal with those events and with fatalities more specifically. And all our efforts do not seem to be curtailing the problem meaningfully. And when you read the investigation reports of some of these incidents, we don't seem to be learning from incidents. We don't seem to be learning from our experiences. And some of the times, these events are repetitions of previous events that have already occurred. So yes, I think it's a huge area of potential improvement. And psychosocial also is in that kind of challenge area because it is even more nebulous than physical safety. So I agree, I share the concern. I'm also a big believer in sometimes we've got to start in the positive side of the equation and looking at what can we do well and be better at, and thinking about, each hazard has a negative and a positive side or a protective side. And perhaps the way to start biting the elephant one bite at a time is to start thinking about, what are the aspects of the positive side of these hazards, if managed well, that could really fundamentally change the way our business works. If people came to work and they were healthier, they were more mentally engaged, how would that impact other things? And I think that's probably, at least initially, the in that we have, because the big carrot, the big stick is not going to work. It doesn't work. It's never worked terribly well. So the carrot aspect of this is actually, there's a huge potential here to create a workplace that is thriving, that is more human, that is more open to the fuller experience of being a person. And that then unlocks a whole bunch of value that is the kind of value that in the future is going to be more and more difficult to gain, particularly in the age of AI, when there's so much competition for what truly cannot be replaced by a machine or by an intelligence in inverted commas. So I think that's the space in which I really see this going. I think psychosocial risk is probably more about the psychosocial opportunity and the psychosocial way in which we can interact with technology in healthier, more sustainable ways to unlock value. And then in doing that, working backwards to fix the not so good and the adverse side of the equation. But maybe I'm just an idealist.
Oh, no, I think
But
I think we're equal measure idealists as well as trying to advocate for corrective actions. Do you reckon? Greg?
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
I'm more cynical, as you know, Kate, and I don't disagree, and I'm not being a killjoy.
Maybe just a little.
You have to appreciate the position that I'm in. So I'm on the side of nobody rings me up and says, Smithy, things are going swimmingly well. My phone rings.
Things are working so well.
No one rings me and says that either, to be fair.
No, so,
but what I
but can I put this, and I'll put it through you, Kate, that message of the potential upside to organisations getting people management right, getting safety right. That's a message we've been trying to sell for a long, long time. And I know it does land in some organisations, and that's the problem. If you look at this through your own lens, all you see is, for me, you see lots of failure, lots of disappointment, lots of misery. That's what sits on that side of the fence. And we know there are organisations who do it well. And we had a conversation yesterday about an organisation that I think tapped into some of exactly what Rod was talking about. So what we probably need, and again, we mentioned this in the last conversation Kate and I had, safety in particular, and I think psychosocial risk as a subset of that, is something that is very, very, very easy to criticise because of the way it works or doesn't work and the way it's perceived at the front line and all of that. And we don't have enough space in safety for positive storytelling about what works, why it works, and how it works. And in part, it's because I think we blow up our own narratives. So if an organisation comes along and says, we put in place this program and we reduced the number of incidents we're having by 30%. Well, the minute you have that conversation, somebody will jump into the conversation and say, yeah, but the Deepwater Horizon went 7 years without a lost time injury before they blew that up. So that, and I'm one of those people because my job is to actually look for evidence of success that I can use as opposed to injury rate data, which I can't. So I don't disagree with anything, and I agree that if we can meaningfully sell the upside and get enough people on the upside journey, that's going to take us a lot further than prosecutions and big fines. I fully accept that. And if someone could find a way to make that breakthrough, I think we'd all be better off.
I think it's fascinating to me, the more that we get into these conversations, the more episodes that we have, Greg. And the reason I wanted to talk about this, and one of my key points in the market, is about this role that leaders play, and this linchpin role that leaders play across all of this. And there is, I can remember presenting somewhere last week or the week before, and I said, the way that the world of work has changed in my years working in the last 30 years is so dramatic. Yet I am yet to find an organisation that has had the same quantum change and leap in the way that they train their leaders, support their leaders, and design leadership roles such that leadership is maintaining a sense of being fit for purpose for the modern workplace and the modern expectations. And the research time and time again, papers time and time again, keep coming back to this critical component about the role that leadership plays. And yet we are not seeing quantum shifts in the way that leadership is designed, supported and executed in organisations. And to me, I reckon that's why we're not seeing the results that everybody expects to see, because we all know the role that leaders play, yet we're not doing anything to quantumly change the design of the leaders and the system that leaders work in. So I don't know, that's where I would be putting my attention, and that's what I will continue to speak about, and let's see where it goes.
I mean, it just strikes me that most leadership roles in most organisations, and this is not pejorative at all, but are fundamentally technocrats who are just designed to keep the cogs turning within the set KPIs, and that the welfare of the genuine welfare of people. And I'm not saying people don't care about people. It's hard to have this conversation without sounding critical of everything. I think most people genuinely care for, other people. But what that looks like and how that works in practice is like complex.
How you do it. Yeah. Well, I'm conscious of we're now at a 50-minute record. So as expected, another rich conversation. And thank you so much for joining us again, Rod. Is there a quick little summary or takeout from all of that, other than go and buy my book?
Buy the book.
That you would
buy
like
the book.
You would like to give listeners, and we will put we would put a link to your book. We're more than happy to support your book, Rod.
It's a great read.
Thank you. All I was going to say is that you prompt me to kind of, the world of work has transformed, but the humans in it haven't caught up. And that's really where we need to, and it's about to transform even further, right? And so we really need to think about what it is that the humans are doing, and how do we scaffold them? How do we make sure that they continue to be able to thrive in these systems that we are now creating with, I was talking to someone last week. She's managing agents as well as people in her own team, and she's like, I don't know how that works. So, this idea that we now have machines interspersed with people, we haven't even thought about the psychosocial aspect of that, but also the practical aspect of that. And I think, your comment prompts me to just kind of end by saying we really need to think about, how the human is allowed to be optimal in what comes next. And if we do that, then I think we start to open the door to some better things.
Better outcomes for that, which is what everyone wants. Well, thank you, Rod. Thank you, Greg.
Pleasure.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for this two-parter on Rod's amazing book, The Net Effect. And we really do encourage you to go and read that and to percolate on all its wonderful, wonderful information and thoughts. So have a great rest of your week, everybody, and thanks again for joining us. Bye.
Thanks
Thank
all.
you.
Bye
Bye.
both. Bye.
That's a wrap for another episode of Judgmental. Thanks again to our sponsors, EML. EML's Mutual Benefits Program provides organisations with free services, tools and resources to manage their workplace risk. You can follow EML, myself and Greg on LinkedIn, and be sure to check the show notes for links to the papers referenced in each episode, as well as resources available to help you as you navigate the wonderfully complex and nuanced world of psychosocial risk. See you again next time at the bar.